Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm David Myers, your host of the podcast. The post-October 7th world has been exceptionally trying for college campuses in this country, as conflicting political passions and interests have divided students, faculty, administrators, and alumni, and have prompted a renewed debate over the principle of free speech and whether there are or should be any limits to it. In fact, this debate was not born of October 7th and its aftermath, but has been a constant topic in American higher education and more generally in American political culture. To help us gain perspective on this debate, its history, present-day manifestations, and consequences, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast David Cole, National Legal Director of the ACLU and the George Mitchell Professor of Law and Public Policy at Georgetown Law School. David Cole is one of the country's most renowned civil libertarians and a person of uncommon intellectual breadth and experience. He is at once a veteran Supreme Court litigator, a deep thinker, and a prolific author. Among his 7 books are the award-winning No Equal Justice, Race and Class in the American Criminal Justice System from 1999, and Enemy Aliens, Double Standards and Constitutional Freedoms in the War on Terrorism from 2004. He writes regularly for the New York Review of Books and The Nation, and his op-eds have appeared in the New York Times and the LA Times. In all of his work, David Cole remains a true believer in the importance of listening to the views of those with whom one disagrees. Welcome to Then and Now, David.
Nice to be here.
So you recently reviewed a book by Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott called The Canceling of the American Mind that depicts a very dire situation in this country regarding our tolerance for diverse opinions. They say it's never been this bad. You disagree. I wonder if you could explain. When has it been this bad?
So, it's very hard to measure how bad it is, and it always feels like it's worse right now. Certain presentism tends to infect the way we view the world, and certainly infects the way FIRE views the world. So, FIRE being the nonprofit that Mr. Lukianoff is the president of, and his co-author also works at, and they are a nonprofit that fights for academic freedom on campus. And they claim in their book that the cancel culture is essentially the worst it's ever been for free speech in America, worse even than the McCarthy era. And I just think, that it's very hard to take that seriously. I mean, what we have today, for the most part, is a culture of intolerance in which some private, students and private scholars are intolerant of the views of others, and sometimes, criticize them for expressing views that they disagree with, and sometimes even shout them down. And that's troubling, to be sure. And I am as very disturbed about cancel culture. But, it is not the McCarthy era. The McCarthy era was a government-led effort targeted at anyone who was associated with the Communist Party or got a communist magazine or hung out with someone who was associated with the Communist Party or had a relative who might be associated with someone who was with the Communist Party. Some of them were prosecuted. Many lost their government jobs. Millions were subjected to formal inquiries. So, a culture of cancellation is problematic, but it is distinct from a government-led, targeted effort to suppress, particular political points of view.
And what would you say about what you've discussed elsewhere, the Florida state laws like Stop Woke or Don't Say Gay? That is an instance of government intervention.
Yeah, so those, I think it is fair to sort of compare what's going on in Florida to the McCarthy era, because that is government intervention in academic freedom. It's state-led. It's enacted through laws. The Stop Woke Act identifies 8 proscribed ideas and prohibits any professor from endorsing those ideas. Even if it's the ideas are fully within the subject matter that they are teaching and the like. So there you've got government officials seeking to determine what can and can't be said on campus. That is very much like the McCarthy era. But when people talk about cancel culture, it's usually the right criticizing leftist students and professors for criticizing or not wanting to listen to conservative voices. And that's very different. You don't have liberal statutes enacted that are seeking to suppress conservative points of view. So I think there's cancellation on the right and on the left, but the cancellation on the right is backed by government power. The cancellation on the left is not. And I'm not trying to, say that cancellation on the left is good. I'm just saying we should recognize that these are important distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Can you flesh out a little bit the connection between free speech and cancel culture? How do you see the relationship between the two of them?
So, if by cancel culture you mean private individuals exercising their rights to drown out or try to or criticize someone else for what they have said, that's actually a sort of clash of First Amendment rights. A right-wing group invites someone to come speak on campus. That's their First Amendment right. A left-wing group stands outside and protests. That's their First Amendment right. And so that's really a situation in which you've got a clash of First Amendment rights. I don't think you have a First Amendment right to shout down. You don't have a First Amendment right to obstruct, but it's essentially a clash of First Amendment rights. It is not the government coming in and suppressing a particular point of view because they disagree with that point of view, which is, that's what you have in Florida with the Stop Woke Act. That is the government identifying viewpoints and saying these viewpoints cannot be expressed. That's, to me, categorically different from students saying we don't want to hear a certain set of viewpoints.
Right. The criterion that sort of triggers restraints on speech are severe and pervasive actions that are directed against individuals, as you, I think, argue, that amount to harassment. And that's when speech tips over into something that's actionable or requires some measure of constraint. Is that right?
So now I think this is I think you're moving into a different area. You're moving in the area of when is it appropriate or required for a university to suppress speech? When is it required? And it's required when that speech constitutes harassment on the basis of race or sex or religion. You can so you have the right to speak freely. You don't have the right to direct your prejudiced views against a woman because she's a woman, or a black person because he's black, or a Jewish person because they're Jewish. That can constitute discrimination under Title IX, which requires universities to ensure that all students have equal access to education. So in that situation, there is a constraint on speech, but it comes from the obligation of the institution to ensure that everybody has equal access to an education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason I'm sort of moving around is I wanted to go back to another historical episode that in a certain sense brings together these two strains of discourse that involves the organization of which you're the national legal director. And that is the episode in 1977 when the ACLU defended the rights of neo-Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, which had a large percentage of residents who were Holocaust survivors. Do you think that was the right decision?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think it was the right decision. Look, am I a fan of Nazi ideology? Absolutely not. I mean, it is repulsive. It is absolutely atrocious. But in the public sphere, right, outside of a kind of constrained context like an employment setting or a university, in the public sphere, people have the right to express incredibly hateful points of view, incredibly prejudiced points of view, and they do it all the time. And so that's what was going on in Skokie. And if you say, well, no, actually, communities are permitted to suppress views and deny access to public spaces to speak to those who they find offensive, then you've given up on the First Amendment. Because every community can define that in a different way. There's no sort of, Holocaust exception. There's no racist speech exception. Once you sort of say what offends a group of people can be suppressed by the government, you've empowered any community to use its representatives to exclude those who are dissenters. And so, I don't think anybody relished the representation of the Nazis, but I think people thought it was the right thing to do. I think it was the right thing to do. The Supreme Court said it was the right thing to do. And we continue to do that to this day. I just argued in the Supreme Court last week on behalf of the NRA in a First Amendment case. We disagree with the NRA deeply, but we recognize that if you allow government officials to target the NRA for its political views for punishment, then other governments are going to be able to target Planned Parenthood or a trans rights group or an immigrants' rights group.
So, what do you think have been the most serious threats to that principle of free speech to which the ACLU is so devoted? Say since Skokie, you wrote a book on the treatment of enemy combatants, those perceived enemy combatants after 9/11. Was the 9/11 era one in which we saw government attempts to constrain speech, or the Trump era? Have there been serious challenges that have caused you concern until the present moment?
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's ever a time in which government officials somewhere, in this country, have sought to silence or penalize those with whom they, disagree. Whether it's the, people who burn the flag, or whether it's people who engage in Black Lives Matter protests, or members of the Westboro Baptist Church who protest at a funeral and engage in homophobic speech, or the Washington metro system, which denies controversial speakers any access to their ad space on their buses and on their trains and the like. I mean, the nature of the First Amendment. The reason we have a First Amendment is because there was a real recognition that, one, free speech is absolutely essential to a democracy. Two, government officials will always be tempted to suppress the views that they find offensive or that they disagree with. And so I don't think, I think there are times where I do think our society right now is more riven. And so there's more intolerance, and that will often lead to more efforts to penalize speech with which we disagree. But I don't think there's been any golden era of free speech. I think that there's been a struggle in this country over free speech for our entire history. I do think the Supreme Court got to a pretty good place in terms of identifying some very important protections for free speech by the sort of 1960s, 1970s, informed by the Red Scare, informed by the McCarthy era, informed by the Civil Rights era, where government officials really, went overboard and abused all sorts of statutes to try to silence those with whom they disagreed. And the Supreme Court eventually established a fair number of quite speech protective doctrines. But so it's not as if we have to kind of develop those doctrines, but we have to defend those doctrines from constant attack.
Right. And that seems especially difficult in the age of the internet, in the age of social media, when anybody can say anything without constraint, and in which encourages a certain measure of disinhibition. Like, you say everything that you think. There's nothing that should be held back.
Well, there's no editor. There's no editor.
And there's no self-editor either. I think that's part of the... So in a recent essay in the New York Review of Books, you seem to push back against the view that social media or the internet were the cause of the decline of civilization, as it were. What's your argument there?
So, I think there's a lot of talk about disinformation and misinformation, and social media being the really at the root of why we are so divided. I don't disagree that that social media has played a role in the way in which we have sort of put ourselves in two warring camps, and because it means that we are increasingly likely to get our news and our information from people with whom we agree and not be exposed to people with whom we disagree. But I don't think it's limited to social media. Look at television, look at Fox News and MSNBC. I think they're essentially mirror images of each other. I'm sure many people will be mad at me for saying that, but in the sense that they have certain set of views that they advance and a certain set of views that they will not, consider, except to, roundly reject them. And so, and if you look back at history, there's newspapers, magazines have often been quite partisan to take in particular, views. There's often been very deep disagreements in this country among sort of warring political parties. Sometimes it's, as in the Civil War and in the early years of our republic, it led to, actual violence and the like. So I just don't think you can sort of say social media is the be all and end all of the problem.
How would you trace the roots of the problem as we see it? The roots of this intolerance that manifests in cancel culture. Where do you see it issuing from?
So, I would recommend Ezra Klein's book, Why We Are Polarized, for a kind of fulsome discussion of how it is that our country has come to divide itself into these two warring camps. And there's a lot of things that have contributed to it. But one of the things I think he points out is that once you reach that point in which we're sort of evenly and sharply divided, it's very hard to get past that, because every fight seems to be about whether, one party has majority control or the other party has majority control. And so you're not likely to compromise. It's critically important that your party, you stick with your party. And so it's hard to know how you get out of something like that. I think sometimes national crises have gotten us over those sorts of things. A war is one thing that has in the past sometimes gotten us out of.
You're not recommending that.
But I'm not recommending that. And we had a crisis. We had COVID, and COVID, if COVID was non-denominational, it attacked all of us. It made all of us vulnerable. And you might think that would bring us together, but the divides very quickly appeared with respect to even responding to something like that. So, I'm very concerned about the situation we're in, but and there are many causes, and social media is one of them, but not the only one. My point is simply that the answer is not giving government control over social media, as two states, Florida and Texas, have sought to do by passing laws that are said to be designed to bar censorship by social media platforms. I do think that the academy is a critically important locus to try to get beyond some of this, because it's a place and a sort of vanishingly small percentage of places in this country where people do come together who disagree. You put together a class of students and they come from all over the country, and they are, they're no longer in their bubble, and they're confronting people who are quite different from each other, and in a context in which there's a real emphasis on, or should be anyway, an emphasis on exposure to a wide variety of ideas, testing beliefs rather than simply asserting beliefs, and the like. And so that's why I'm so concerned about the attacks on academic freedom, the Stefanik kind of hearings and investigations, which I think are really a threat to, and the Florida kinds of laws, which I think are really a threat to this critically important setting for and encouraging people to hear each other, listen to each other, speak to each other, and not simply hear from the people they already agree with.
Yeah. I want to get to college campuses, to which I think we'll devote a good portion of our time. But I want to just go back to something you mentioned about government regulation. As you know, there's been a tremendous amount of demand for stricter regulation of major social media corporations, based on the belief that the people who produce social media platforms have their own vested interests in place, which are not to restrict access, but to open the floodgates to as much access as possible. And that includes highly toxic and dangerous perspectives, points of view, calls to action. You were quite clear in your recent review of the book by Lee Bollinger and Jeffrey Stone that the government should not play that role as the regulator of social media. Can you explain why?
Sure. Look, I'm not super happy with Elon Musk and Zuckerberg controlling what we see and what we can say. But I'm even less happy with Governor DeSantis or Governor Abbott controlling what we see or say. And I think social media is media. It is a speech platform, just as bookstores are, newspapers are, and the First Amendment protects the rights of speech platforms, places where private entities provide opportunities for speech. The First Amendment protects their right to make editorial decisions about what they want to sell or not sell, or publish or not publish. So no one has a right to publish an op-ed in the New York Times. No one has a right to have their books sold in a particular bookstore. But those bookstores, because those bookstores have their own right to decide what they want to sell and not sell, and the newspapers have their right to determine what pieces they want to publish and don't want to publish. And social media platforms are just another form of that sort of private speech outlet. They have the same editorial freedom, and the problem. I think there is a problem with social media platforms. The problem is that there's this incredible concentration of power in a handful of platforms. That is problematic. But, that has been true also sort of historically. There were only a few, major newspapers that, were the ones that people really paid attention to. There were only a few television stations. Even now, when we have massive numbers of television stations, there's only a few that most people watch. And they exercise tremendous control over who gets on and who doesn't get on. But I don't think the answer is to give the government the power to decide who gets to speak on Fox News, who gets to post on X and the like.
Does the FCC not play some role in sort of regulating what can and can't be said on television?
Not really anymore.
What happened there? Because once upon a time, there were the words you couldn't say, and the FCC was the fastidious guardian of that.
Well, so the court, with respect to television and radio in particular, before cable, the court reasoned that because these were scarce resources that the government actually gave out, the frequencies, were scarce resources that the government gave out and gave monopoly power to a handful of entities to control, the government, it was permissible, therefore, for the government to employ something called the Fairness Doctrine, which required television and radio stations to cover issues of public interest and to do so in a balanced way. It was widely criticized. It was fairly weakly enforced, and eventually the FCC abandoned that. But that was held to be constitutional only because of the scarce resource of television and radio frequencies. That's not true with respect to cable. That's not true with respect to print media. That's not true with respect to social media. And then, you also talked about the power of the FCC to prohibit offensive speech on television, or at least, limit the hours in which offensive speech could be broadcast on television. That was justified by the particularly intrusive nature, of the television into the home, and you could, turn it on, and you would be confronted with and radio confronted with these with these offensive words, and that justified a kind of restriction that would otherwise not be permissible. But that again is not applicable to social media, where you have to search for, you have to choose to go to the particular place that you go to. So I think those were narrow exceptions to the general rule, and the general rule is the government should keep its hands off of content decisions that speakers and publishers and platforms that promote speech make, and it's the private entities' decisions that should govern what is said on those in those contexts, not the government's.
And how confident should we be about the capacity of those private companies, those corporations, to do the job that you're describing?
Yeah, well, nobody's perfect, to be sure.
And they're competing interests, right? There are competing interests.
Yes, and there are competing interests, to be sure. But I will say this: I think the answer in the sort of journalism world was the development of a set of professional norms about objectivity, about reporting, and the like. And that it does what it does, and it doesn't work perfectly, but it is better, I think, than empowering the government to impose a set of rules, and then having government officials with a particular political ideologies enforcing those rules in very problematic ways. I think that's ultimately where the way to go. I think in the social media context, there's also a kind of a set of norms that have developed that lead social media platforms to try to be open to a wide range of perspectives, to not suppress speech simply because they disagree with it. It's part of what they sell is an open platform in which anyone can speak and the like. Do they censor? Do they take things down? Absolutely. If they didn't take things down, they would be unusable. They would be filled with pornography, with hate, with irrelevant material. So with spam. So the only way that social media can work is by empowering the platforms to engage in content moderation, decisions about what they're going to put up, what they're not going to put up, what they're going to promote and what they're not going to promote, but then to hold them accountable for doing that in a fair, transparent, and open way. And so, Facebook has the right under the First Amendment to take stuff down totally arbitrarily. And to take people, to knock people off totally arbitrarily. It could have done that with President Trump, but it didn't. It gave reasons. It subjected those reasons to a review by the Facebook Oversight Board. It tried to justify what it was doing in terms that were, that were consistent with the norms that we expect these platforms to. And I think, by and large, I think they actually do a pretty good job, at least in terms of allowing a wide range of views to be expressed and not sort of penalizing speech because they disagree with its point of view. They do take down false information. They take down dangerous information. They take down, racist information, deeply offensive stuff. And, that's totally within their rights to do.
So is it your general operating principle that the antidote to bad speech is more speech? Sort of open up the portals so that you can have this wide array of perspectives?
I think yes. Do I think that is a perfect answer? No. But what's better? What's better is if the choice is the antidote to bad speech more speech or empowering government to suppress the speech that it thinks is bad speech, then yes, more speech is a better solution than empowering the government to suppress the speech that it finds problematic, because government has a self-interest in self-perpetuation and in suppressing the views of those who criticize it. And so you can't, I don't have a Pollyannish view that, the marketplace of ideas will lead to truth and, all of that. But it's a little bit like, democracy. It's the worst system except for all the others.
The Churchillian principle. And that reminds us that Europe has a different set of understandings of how to deal with this question. There's first of all, a tradition of sort of robust defense against hate speech, given Europe's history in the 20th century. And as a result of that, as far as I understand, there's a more potent regulatory system in place to deal with social media and social media corporations. Could you ever imagine the United States reaching the point where you might feel we need that? We need to impose some constraints? I mean, it's such a distinctly American tradition, right? That robust support for free speech. Could you ever imagine moving in the direction of Europe?
It's hard to say without having had the history that they have had. But I would say, I think some people who are in favor of suppressing hate speech would say we have had that history. Look at slavery. The Holocaust was horrific, but slavery was also horrific. And so, hate speech and the KKK, and so you could point to historical justifications for regulating hate speech here that are not that categorically different from the justifications advanced in Europe. What I would say about Europe is, I don't know about you, but I see no evidence that the hate speech regulation has led to a more tolerant society, has reduced the appeal of these horrific, hate-filled, populist, leaders and the like. I just don't think it works. I don't think it works to suppress that type of speech, to give the government the power to suppress that type of speech. But I do want to underscore the big social media platforms do actually take down a lot of hate speech, and it's within their right to do that. That's an editorial choice that they can make, just like the New York Times doesn't have to publish some hate-filled op-ed. So it's not like, when you go on Facebook, you're inevitably confronted with hate speech. It's just the government doesn't have the power to compel them to do that.
Yeah. Okay. I want to turn our attention now to the university campus, which we alluded to at various points up till now. You wrote in your February 11th piece in the New York Review of Books about the disastrous congressional hearing on December 5th, 2023, when the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT were asked what they would do if and when they heard chants of genocide to the Jews, if those chants were heard on their campuses. And the answer of the three presidents was basically, it depends on the context. Do you think they answered correctly?
Yeah, I do. I think it was the right answer. It was not the right answer politically at the moment. It wasn't delivered particularly effectively. But I think it is actually the right answer legally. And a couple of things. First of all, I don't know about you. I haven't heard anyone actually chant genocide to the Jews. Representative Stefanik equated calling for jihad,
intifada,
as and I would push back against that.
I would join you in that.
Yeah, equation. But I think so take global intifada, what people do chant. I think if global intifada is directed at a Jewish student by his peers, motivated by anti-Semitism, that could constitute discrimination, which is prohibited under Title IX, a form of religious-based harassment, which schools are permitted or required to regulate under both Title VI and Title IX federal statutes that govern them because they take federal money. But if it's a chant during a protest that happens to be on the campus quad, it's one of many chants during a Palestinian protest, a pro-Palestinian protest. It's not directed at any individual. It may be deeply offensive to some people. It may, in some instances, be motivated by anti-Semitism. It might, in many other instances, not be motivated by anti-Semitism. But even if it's motivated by anti-Semitism, it's something that is has to be tolerated if you're going to have free speech on campus. If it's not directed at any particular individual, if it doesn't rise to the level of religion or race-based.
And David, what if the rally, in that case, sort of made its way to the Hillel building, the Jewish Student Center on campus, with chants, resistance is justified, or for that matter, from the river to the sea? Does that make a difference in your view?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if it's a march or something and it happens to walk by the Hillel Center or even stop in front of the Hillel Center, I don't think it's that would rise to the level of speech that constitutes religious-based discrimination. These are not easy lines to draw, but the basic distinction that the law has made is between a individually targeted racially, religiously, or sex-based motivated, taunt, which is harassment, can be treated as discrimination, is not protected under the First Amendment, and can be punished on the one hand, and then non-targeted by expressions of bias, which are generally protected if they're not targeted at any particular individual. And there's one caveat there, which is that non-targeted speech. So I'm not targeting any particular individual, but I'm making racist statements. If they are so severe or pervasive as to deny equal access to the learning environment of Black students or something, then that can constitute harassment and can be and must be restricted by the university. So drawing that line, when does non-targeted biased expression rise to the level of so severe or pervasive that it denies equal access to education? That's a very hard line to draw, but I will say it's a very high threshold to get over.
Yeah, what always struck me as a kind of specious distinction sort of related to this, but slightly off center, is the distinction between public and private universities. I mean, if you have this principle about creating some boundary beyond which you cannot go, that you feel is protective from the scourge of harassment, why wouldn't it be global? Why would it be restricted to public institutions? Do you think that distinction makes sense today?
So I think in terms of what speech a school has to sort of investigate and punish, that requirement comes from Title IX and Title VI, which are statutes that apply to any school that takes federal money, and virtually every school takes federal money. So the obligation to respond to discrimination on campus is equally applicable to public and private institutions. Public institutions, because they are state actors, because they are the government, they are actually restricted by the First Amendment from, punishing speech that is not discriminatory but happens to be hate speech or something. Private institutions are not restricted by the First Amendment. They are like the social media platforms or the New York Times or Fox News. They can, as a matter of the First Amendment, they could punish hate speech as much as they want. It's more the principle of academic freedom, the principle that in order to have a university, a thriving university setting, it's important to respect the free speech of the participants in the community. It's a norm that essentially requires private universities to sort of have a hands-off position. So like Georgetown, we have a free speech policy that we've imposed on ourselves that requires us to respect views that we find, deeply offensive and distasteful and, hateful and the like. And most private universities have adopted that because they see it as central to the enterprise of academic freedom. But it's not required by law. It's not. Whereas with UCLA, you're actually bound by the Constitution because you are a state institution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to just go back to sort of the distinction between upholding free speech and sort of creating norms of discourse on campus that allow for coexistence. And I want to do that in light of an exchange you had with one of the most distinguished legal scholars in the country in the pages of the New York Review of Books, Professor Lawrence Tribe, who, in response to an article of yours, stated that, and here I'm quoting, "A commitment to free speech can certainly coexist with a rule banning calls on campus for killing all Jews, whatever the specific context." You disagree with that? You don't think that it's possible to carve out rules that wouldn't be disruptive of the overarching principle of free speech, right?
Yeah. So I think you can, come up with some sort of like extreme outlier examples like that and say, well, of course we could prohibit the killing of Jews. But then, what we've seen in the past is that there were efforts in the 1980s in particular on a lot of campuses to pass racist speech laws that prohibited speech that was, sort of seen as extreme outlier. And they were impossible to enforce. They were enforced arbitrarily. They were ultimately, all abandoned. And I think even killing Jews. Well, when a pro-Palestinian rally takes place and someone says from the river to the sea, is that advocating for the killing of Jews? If you are in a pro-Israeli, if you're going to say you can't advocate for the killing of Jews, then you're probably going to say you can't advocate for the killing of Palestinians. Then is a pro-Israel rally which says Israel has the right to defend itself, is that advocating the killing of Palestinians? So the lines get very, very hard to draw very, very quickly. And so I think that's why most private universities have adopted rules that basically say we will not punish people for expressing views that we find disagreeable, offensive, distasteful, even racist, unless they constitute discrimination, which, as we talked about earlier, requires that it be either targeted at a particular individual because of his race or sex or religion, or so severe and pervasive that they deprive people of the targeted group equal access to education.
And yet, a number of private institutions like Columbia University and I believe Brandeis University have banned or suspended the chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine for things that they said. I assume you think that's wrongheaded.
So I don't know all of the facts about the Brandeis situation. The Columbia situation, my understanding is that the student group was suspended for its refusal to abide by a neutrally applicable requirement that you get a permit before, having a demonstration on the property of the university.
Sounds like a technicality.
No, it is a content neutral, reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. It's very common. Like you can't protest after 10 p.m. because you interfere with, or you have to get a permit because we want to be able to say, okay, this group gets to protest this day, then the next day this group gets to protest. We don't have them both protesting at the same time because that can create problems of violence and the like. So those as long as you have content neutral, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, I think that's fine. Once you start saying, people who are advocating on one side of a very contentious dispute, we're going to suppress, and people who are advocating on the other side, we're going to let them speak. That's deeply problematic in a university setting where you're supposed to be open to a range of views. Now, I don't think that this requirement applies everywhere. So I think, for example, in my classrooms, and I'm sure in your classrooms, I want people to be able to say whatever they want to say, but I say you have to do it with respect for the people on the other side. You have to engage in civil disagreement. The government can't require somebody out on the street to speak civilly, but in my classroom, I can require people to speak civilly because that's what will encourage a meaningful discussion. But the rules that apply in the classroom are different from the rules that apply on the campus quad when there's a protest. There's no school requires or should require that protests follow the rules in class. Only speak when you're called up.
And you had an interesting exchange with Larry Tribe on that point as well. But I wonder if we can take a step back and just have you weigh in on what impact you think October 7th has had on the issues that we've been talking about, free speech and cancel culture.
So October 7th, was absolutely horrific, and the aftermath has been horrific, and it has had ripple effects throughout the world and, throughout many institutions in the United States and, especially academic institutions, and has made these issues, so much tougher. One of the things I think I worry about is, I think that before October 7th, there was increasingly a recognition on college campuses that we needed to do more to encourage students to be open to the views of others, to engage with ideas that they find disagreeable, to be confronted by viewpoints that they didn't grow up with, and I say that because I'm involved in an effort to do that at Georgetown, and in that effort, I've looked at what other schools are doing, and in almost every school, there's some effort that is designed to kind of fight cancel culture, promote civil disagreement and dialogue, and that's all a good thing.
Yes, and we have our own Dialogue Across Difference initiative at UCLA that does precisely that.
Yeah, but that all predated October 7th, right? And then October 7th comes, and you've got just very, very contentious, very strongly felt views on both sides, and that's when it's hardest to maintain these lines. That's when the pressure comes to sort of shut things down because people are more likely to find the expression of views that others engage in offensive, and because people, are going to engage in offensive speech more often when passions are high. So, these fights about academic freedom were huge in the Vietnam War era for much the same reason. People felt very strongly on both sides. There was a lot of intolerance for the views of people who are on the other side, and we're in a situation like that right now. So, I worry that if you've got congressional investigations and Elise Stefanik and sort of targeting presidents for trying to be tolerant, if you've got donors saying you've got to shut this stuff down, that we're going to see some real sort of steps back from what I think was a really good development of schools trying to kind of respond to some of the criticisms of intolerance, and particularly intolerance of conservative voices on many college campuses.
So in light of the fact that we are now in a post-October 7th world, and so the degree of difficulty has been raised, what do you think needs to happen to right the ship? Is it possible to, A, reverse the tide of cancel culture, B, protect speech, and C, provide a measure of safety to individuals and groups today from harassment?
Yeah, is it possible? Absolutely. Is it hard? Absolutely. I think what it requires is a real commitment by institutions by academic institutions to hold the line, to explain why they're holding the line to their donors, to Congress, to op-ed writers, to students on both sides and professors on both sides who are urging that certain forms of speech be suppressed, and at the same time to be very take very seriously claims of harassment and discrimination where they exist, and to respond to those as well. So I don't think we can provide safe spaces. I think that is a mistake to try to provide safe spaces. The whole point of a university is not to make you safe, but to make you have to confront the ideas with which you disagree. But I think we do have to provide discrimination-free spaces, and we have to recognize that there is a difference between discrimination on the one hand, which sometimes comes in the form of speech, but generally when it is targeted at an individual, and the expression of points of view that are passionate and that we find deeply offensive, but are protected by the First Amendment and free speech values.
Professor David Cole, legal director of the ACLU, it's always illuminating to be with you. Thank you for making time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
Thanks, David. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.